I never thought that a small garden in front of my house would become the center of a heated battle. To me, it was simply a few rows of greens, a few juicy tomatoes, a few kale bushes stretching out in the morning sun, all the results of my passion and hard work. But to the Homeowners Association, HOA, the garden was a threat, a disruption to the landscape standards they tried to impose on every household in the neighborhood. I'm not a confrontational person, but when I received the first letter demanding the garden be removed, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had planted each plant with my own hands, cared for it, watched it grow, and now, because of an unreasonable regulation, I had to destroy it all? No, I would not yield. Little did I know that decision would land me in a bitter confrontation with the HOA, a fight I didn't seek but also didn't intend to lose. And it all started one peaceful morning, interrupted by the sound of a shovel in my yard. When Jake and I bought our house in Evergreen Haven, the first thing I thought about wasn't the paint color or the furniture, but the small front yard, a perfect space for me to realize my dream, a lush garden where I could grow my own fresh vegetables for my family. I grew up with gardens. My childhood was filled with hot summer days when my mother would carefully tend each tomato plant, trim the leaves of the broccoli, or happily harvest the red strawberries. She once said, "A garden is not only food but also a part of the soul of the house." I believed that, and when I had the opportunity to build my own life, I didn't want to miss it. As soon as I moved in, I got to work. I spent weeks digging the soil, choosing seeds, and patiently planting each vegetable patch. I planted tomatoes, basil, kale, a few carrots, and strawberries for a splash of color. Every day I watered, weeded, and tended the garden with all my heart. I imagined going out in the morning to pick fresh vegetables for breakfast, or sitting quietly in the afternoons by the garden, enjoying the peaceful feeling that nature brought. My garden is not only a piece of land with green vegetables, but also a peaceful corner in the middle of a busy life. I feel proud when I see the plants growing day by day. The leaves are green. The small tomato flowers begin to bloom, signaling a bountiful harvest. Not only me, even the neighbors passing by are interested. An old lady who lives down the street once stopped, smiled kindly, and said, "It's wonderful that there are people who want to grow vegetables instead of just a lifeless lawn." I was even more convinced that I was doing the right thing. However, I did not expect that just because of a few simple vegetable beds, I was about to enter a war that I had never thought of. One morning, while watering the vegetables, I saw a white envelope stuffed in the crack of the door. The bright red stamp of HOA, Homeowners Association, caught my eye. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was some sort of public notice to residents, but when I opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. The neighborhood must maintain uniformity. Please remove your garden within 14 days to avoid fines. I frowned, reading it over and over again. Was I building something that was unsightly or that it would bother my neighbors? My garden wasn't messy or that it was bothering anyone. I even thought it made the neighborhood greener and friendlier. I looked up at my vegetable beds, green in neat rows, each leaf reaching up with vitality under the sunlight. And now, because of an unreasonable clause in the HOA's rules, everything I had worked so hard to build might be demolished. Little did I know then that this letter was just the beginning of a long battle, and I had no intention of backing down. I put the letter down on the table, but the words stuck in my head. Remove garden within 14 days to avoid fines. Why was something as simple as growing vegetables in front of my house considered a violation? I spent the rest of the evening rereading the HOA rules, flipping through the pages of dense clauses. Finally, I found the relevant clause: all property frontages must maintain uniform landscaping with only lawns, shrubs, or ornamental flowers permitted. Vegetables or any form of food growing are not permitted in the front yard. I sighed, but instead of feeling discouraged, I felt even more confused. My garden was clean, neat, and completely undisturbed. If they were really concerned about neighborhood landscaping, why weren't yellow lawns or abandoned gardens overgrown with weeds cited? I told myself that it was probably just a misunderstanding, that if I explained to them that my garden was not unsightly, they would understand. So I decided to email the HOA office, clarifying that I had no intention of demolishing the garden and requesting a meeting to discuss it further. 3 days later, I received a response. But instead of an invitation to discuss, I received a second warning letter. The language was less admonishing and more stern. Failure to comply will result in a $100 weekly fine until the garden is removed. I felt a surge of anger. This was ridiculous. They had no intention of compromising or even listening to me. They just wanted me to cave in. Things escalated quickly. Within a week, I received a third letter, this time with a $100 fine attached, due in 7 days. I couldn't believe it. They were actually fining me for growing vegetables. I wondered if anyone else in the neighborhood had been treated like this. I started to notice other houses. Some had large flower pots right in front of their doors, and one even had wild strawberry bushes growing against the fence. None of them received warning letters or were threatened with fines like I was. I couldn't accept this. I decided to call the HOA office directly to clarify. A woman answered the phone with an indifferent voice. She repeated the same things from the letter that I had already read by heart. When I asked why my yard was considered a violation while other houses with trees in their front yards were not affected, she replied stiffly, "We are just enforcing the rules. If you are not satisfied, you can file a complaint according to the procedure." I hung up, my anger not lessening. It was clear that they were not interested in explaining or having a conversation. They were only interested in making me follow orders without giving me a reasonable reason. The next day, I received another letter, this time an official notice that if I continued to keep the yard, the fine would continue to increase, and that the HOA had the right to intervene directly if I did not comply. I held the warning letter in my hand, feeling angry and frustrated. Why should I have to uproot the garden I had worked so hard to cultivate just because of an unreasonable HOA rule? I looked out at my front yard where the rows of green vegetables swayed in the breeze. Tomatoes were starting to set, kale was growing vigorously, basil smelled delicious when I touched it. They weren't hurting anyone. They weren't detracting from the neighborhood, so why should I destroy them? I knew I had the right to grow vegetables on my land. HOA laws were not above state laws. I spent the evening researching local laws, reading every provision about land ownership and use of private property. One thing was clear: there was no rule that prevented me from growing food on my land. The HOA could make its own rules, but they couldn't go against the common law. This only strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't back down. The next morning, I didn't tear up the garden as they asked. Instead, I continued to water, fertilize, and tend the vegetable beds as usual. I didn't want to cause trouble, but I couldn't just give in without reason. I believed that if I held firm, if I didn't show fear, the HOA would reconsider. But I was wrong. They had no intention of stopping. Just a few days later, another letter arrived. It was more forceful, threatening that if I didn't remove the garden immediately, they had the right to take enforcement action. I frowned as I read each line, trying to find a loophole. What could they do? Break into my yard and pull out all the vegetables themselves? The thought made me laugh at the absurdity of it, but at the same time I knew they weren't kidding. The HOA was known for its tough actions, and if I wasn't prepared, they might make me pay in ways I didn't expect. But I didn't back down. I decided to fight back in my own way. First, I sent a formal response letter citing state laws that protect homeowners' legal rights to use their land. I pointed out that my yard didn't violate any landscaping or sanitation codes, and that if the HOA continued to exert unreasonable pressure, I had the right to appeal to a higher authority or take the matter to court. Next, I started to build support. I talked to my neighbors, sharing my experiences of being threatened by the HOA. Some were outraged, especially those who had had trouble with HOAs before. I even discovered that I wasn't the first person to be targeted. Others had been fined for seemingly insignificant reasons, like choosing the wrong color door or planting the wrong type of tree. This injustice only made me more determined. If I gave in, I would be accepting that the HOA would control my house with unreasonable regulations. I couldn't let that happen. So instead of tearing up the garden, I continued to tend to it every day as a clear statement that I would not give in. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. This was my house, and I had the right to protect it. I knew I had angered the HOA by ignoring their warnings, but I didn't think they would go so far as to do something so blatant. I didn't hear back from them for several days after I sent my response. I assumed they had realized their mistake, or at least were considering a more equitable regulation. But then, one Saturday morning, before I had even taken my first sip of coffee, an unusual sound from the front yard startled me. I jumped at the strange noise. When I walked out the door, my heart was pounding in my chest. 3 people, a woman and 2 men wearing shirts with the HOA logo, holding shovels and large sacks, were bending down to pull out each vegetable plant in my garden. Rows of young broccoli were uprooted, tomatoes were crushed, and dirt was everywhere. One of them was rolling up the small fence I had put up to protect my plants. I rushed over, my breath quickening with anger. They had no legal papers, no court order, no prior communication with me. They had simply come, treated my garden like trash, and started cleaning it up. I yelled at them to stop immediately, but Jeff, the HOA supervisor, just looked up, eyes alight, then turned away as if I didn't exist. "We're just enforcing the rules," he said, his voice as matter-of-fact as if he were announcing a mowing, not a destruction of my private property. I felt a surge of helplessness and anger as I watched each row of vegetables being dragged, each tree stump crushed beneath their feet. What I had fought so hard to protect, what I had invested my life in, was being destroyed right before my eyes with no one caring. Not willing to stand idly by, I lunged forward and pulled back one of the sacks they had stuffed my plants into, pulling out a tomato plant with its roots still intact. I felt my hands shaking with anger as I looked at the damp soil clinging to the torn leaves. What right did they have to do this? My garden had not harmed anyone. My anger turned into action. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the entire process of their destruction of my garden. Every face, every movement. Did they think I would stay silent like the others? They were wrong. I felt my heart pounding as I dialed the emergency number. This time I was not alone in this fight. I would not let them win. I clutched the phone in my hand, my heart pounding as I watched my garden being destroyed before my eyes. The rows of tomatoes, kale, and basil that I had tended day after day were now nothing more than uprooted stumps, scattered among the disturbed soil. The men in flower shirts continued their work, coldly cleaning up the mess, as if it weren't my property, as if my work had no value. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. They had no right to do this. I took a deep breath to calm myself, but my hand was gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles were white. If I didn't act now, they would rip it all out. I yanked the screen open and dialed 911. As soon as the operator's voice came through, I tried to keep my voice calm, but I couldn't hide the anger boiling inside me. I told them that there were trespassers on my property, vandalizing my garden without my permission. I wasn't calling because of a normal civil dispute. I was calling because this was property damage and I needed protection. When I finished the call, I looked up and saw that one of the HOA staff had realized that I had called the police. He paused for a moment, exchanged glances with his colleague, then continued working, but I could see the hesitation in his every move. They didn't expect me to resist to this extent. Maybe they were used to giving orders and forcing residents to obey without anyone daring to resist. But I was different. I couldn't let them do this without consequences. I stepped closer, raised my phone to record the whole scene. Mindless hands were tearing up each vegetable stalk. The garbage bags were slowly filling up with what had once been my lush garden. I recorded every face, every action, every expression. If they thought they could do this silently, they were wrong. 10 minutes seemed like an eternity, but then I heard sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. A patrol car pulled up in front of my house. As soon as the officers got out, the HOA members froze, some even backing away. I took the opportunity and walked toward the police, feeling tense, but also relieved. I finally had a force strong enough to confront them. I pointed at the men still standing around the pile of uprooted vegetables, my voice shaking with anger. I wanted them to be held accountable. I wanted them to know that they couldn't just come into my house and destroy my property without consequence. The police listened, taking notes, while the HOA members began to look confused. They might be used to giving orders, but they weren't used to being challenged. I knew this was just the beginning of a long fight, but I didn't feel alone anymore. I had stood up for my rights, and I wouldn't stop until justice was my own. 10 minutes seemed like an eternity, but then I heard sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. A patrol car pulled up slowly in front of my house. The HOA members paused. Some even backed away. They hadn't expected me to go this far. The patrol car stopped right in front of my house. 2 police officers got out, calm but stern. One of them walked toward me, his eyes scanning the devastated garden. Garbage bags full of uprooted vegetables, mounds of dirt torn up. The small fence I had built to protect the cabbage patch now rolled up and scattered across the yard. I swallowed the anger that threatened to explode and tried to keep my voice as calm as possible as I explained the whole thing. I pointed to the men still standing furtively by the pile of uprooted vegetables and explained everything that had happened. I emphasized that they had no court order, no authority to enforce my personal property. An officer stepped forward facing the woman who appeared to be the leader. I had seen her before on the warning letters. Jeff, a woman with a firm, authoritative demeanor. If she had been firm and determined on my property, now that she was in front of the police, that confidence was starting to fade. The officer crossed his arms, looking directly at Jeff, his voice low but authoritative. He asked Jeff to explain why the HOA was here on my private property and what legal basis he had for taking enforcement action. I saw the confusion on Jeff's face as soon as the question was asked. She looked around at her colleagues as if seeking support, but no one dared to speak. Jeff cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. She pulled a document from her briefcase and flipped through it quickly. I watched her every move, and one thing was clear. She had nothing. What she had were the HOA's general bylaws, internal rules that had no legal force to justify the destruction of private property. The officer took the document, skimmed it slowly, then looked up, his eyes sharp. He asked again, this time more directly, "Do you have a valid court order?" With no way to dodge, Jeff pursed his lips, clenched his fists, and shook his head. I saw that moment clearly. the moment she realized she had gone too far without any legal protection. They can coerce residents with warning letters, they can threaten them with unreasonable fines, but when faced with the real law, they have nothing to defend themselves against. The atmosphere became heavy. One of the HOA officers standing behind me began to shuffle his feet as if he wanted to leave the scene as soon as possible. I remained silent, but a strange sense of satisfaction was slowly rising in my heart. They thought they could use their power to force me to comply, but they had forgotten that not everyone would succumb to unreasonable pressure. The officer returned the file to Jeff, but instead of leaving, he kept his eyes firmly on the faces of the people in front of him. He didn't need to say another word, but the message was clear. The HOA had no right to act as they did. They couldn't continue to blatantly invade other people's property without being held accountable. I felt a sense of relief spread through my chest. For the first time since this war began, I knew I wasn't standing alone. Jeff clenched the file in her hand, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. The officer kept his face stoic, waiting for a convincing answer, but the HOA had nothing but meaningless internal rules. No court orders, no regulatory approvals, just rules they had made up and arbitrarily imposed on the residents. The air was heavy, as if everyone realized the game had changed. I crossed my arms, watching the confusion spread among the HOA staff. They had come here with absolute confidence, thinking I would do nothing but watch my yard get destroyed. But now, with the police on my side, they could no longer act so brazenly. I looked at Jeff, waiting for an explanation, some kind of defense, but she just stood there, her jaw set as if trying to swallow the defeat that had just engulfed her. Finally, the officer seemed to lose patience. He walked toward Jeff, looking her straight in the eye, his voice calm but authoritative. He told her that there was no legal basis for the HOA's actions and that they should leave the area immediately. I could see a simmering anger flashing in Jeff's eyes, as if she couldn't stand being stopped, but she had no choice. If they stayed any longer, they risked being sued for trespassing and vandalism, and I certainly wouldn't hesitate to do that. One by one, the HOA staff began to gather their belongings. Shovels were thrown back into the carts. Sacks full of plants were left by the wall. No one said a word, but I could feel the tension in the air. I kept my eyes on them, watching their every move, as if I let them down for a moment, they might turn around and continue what they had started. But they couldn't. They lost. Jeff was the last to leave. She turned back to look at me once, her eyes filled with annoyance and displeasure, as if I had ruined their perfect plan. But I didn't care. I just stood there, not flinching, not showing any fear. This was my house, this was my yard, and I had saved it. The HOA car rolled out of the neighborhood, leaving an eerie silence behind. I stood still, feeling my heart rate slow. The police were still there, taking notes, but I didn't pay them any attention anymore. I looked back at my yard, ravaged but not completely destroyed. I took a deep breath, then bent down and began to rebuild it all. I didn't know what the HOA would do to me tomorrow, but I knew I had won an important battle, a battle to protect what was mine. I stood silently in the middle of the garden, feeling the breeze that blew by, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faintest whiff of the remaining green foliage. The HOA car had left, but the traces of the confrontation were still visible. The beds were torn up, the vegetable plants were uprooted, a few tomato leaves were crushed under the weight of shoes that didn't belong there. But despite the devastation, the garden was not completely destroyed. I bent down, touching each remaining vegetable root, feeling the moisture from the ground. The tomato plants, though trampled, still had their roots intact. and a few kale plants only needed to be planted and watered again to continue growing. I looked around, realizing that despite the HOA's attempts to force me to give in, they had failed. They could not break my will, could not force me to submit to the unreasonable rules they tried to impose. That afternoon, I spent hours cleaning up. I picked up every stalk, covered the stumps that could still be saved, and rebuilt my little fence. Sweat beaded on my forehead, but I felt lighter than ever. The young plants were fragile but resilient, and I knew that in a few days they would be back as good as new. News of my confrontation with the HOA spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors had watched from afar, giving curious glances and nods of approval as they watched me stand up for my rights. I received a few inquiries, and some even shared their own stories of being threatened by the HOA with unreasonable regulations. But no one had ever fought back as strongly as I had. I knew that many people were afraid, but I was not one of them. The next day, I received another letter from the HOA, but this time it wasn't a warning. They announced that they would be reviewing their vegetable gardening regulations, and in the meantime, I would be allowed to keep my garden. They didn't admit to any wrongdoing, but clearly they had been forced to back down. I folded the letter, a small smile on my face. I knew they weren't doing this out of goodwill. They were doing it because they had no choice. They had lost, and they knew it. As for me, not only did I keep my garden, I proved that no one had the right to impose unreasonable things on me without being challenged. As I stepped out into the yard, the afternoon sun shone down on the newly restored vegetable beds. A tomato leaf fluttered in the wind, a reminder that everything was vulnerable but not defeated. I took a deep breath, smelled the familiar earthy scent, and knew that from now on, this garden would not only be a place to grow vegetables, but also a symbol of victory. A victory for personal freedom that no one could take away. From that day on, things in the neighborhood changed a little. Some neighbors started planting small pots of vegetables in front of their houses, perhaps inspired by my story. No one looked at HOA with absolute fear anymore. I knew that in the future they might continue to try to impose new rules, but I also knew one thing for sure. I would not back down. I bent down and gently mounded soil around a newly planted tomato plant. I smiled as I watched the green leaves sway in the gentle breeze. My garden had survived, and so had I. Are you willing to fight for what you believe in? Share your story in the comments.